Amina and Jomo were born beneath the same moon, their cries blending into the soft hum of the river that kissed their village's edge. From the time they could walk, they were each other's shadow. Jomo with his wide-eyed curiosity, always questioning the sky, and Amina, fierce and watchful, always shielding him from hidden thorns. The villagers often said that even the wind waited for them to pass before blowing. That's how in sync they were. When their parents died of the fever that swept through the region 5 seasons ago, Amina took Jomo's hand and became both mother and sister, her small frame stretched thin between grief and responsibility. Jomo never forgot that. Every morning before the roosters crowed, he left a wildflower at her bedside. Every evening he rubbed her tired feet with oil, humming lullabies their mother once sang. They weren't just siblings, they were soul-bonded. But peace is never left untouched in a land where greed festers quietly. A land dispute emerged when their uncle, Ntemi, a man whose eyes were always scanning for what he could claim, declared that the land left to Amina and Jomo had once belonged to his father, and thus should return to him. The elders, unsure of the truth and too afraid to confront Ntemi's growing power, deferred judgment. Amina, who had memorized every boundary stone and every tree root in that field, stood firm. "This land fed our parents," she said to the council, her voice hard like fired clay. "They planted hope here. Buried our first dog here. My brother learned to walk between these trees." But Ntemi was not one to listen to memories. He arrived at their doorstep with papers and a foreign man in glasses who claimed to be a government land surveyor. Amina smelled a lie, thick and bitter like rotting yams. That night, she warned Jomo not to go near the disputed land. "He will try something," she whispered, her hand gripping his wrist. "Stay away from the river path. Stay away from the fields. Promise me." Jomo, now 15, taller than her by a handspan, smiled. "You've always protected me. Let me protect us now." He didn't say where he was going, but when Amina woke the next morning, the wildflower wasn't at her bedside. She searched everywhere. From the edge of the forest to the rocky hills where they once hid during rainstorms. His sandals were found near the river's bend, one sole half buried in mud, the other torn as if yanked off mid-run. But no Jomo. Ntemi was the one who called the council. With a sorrowful face so theatrical it bordered on mockery, he announced, "A tragedy. The boy drowned. I found his body downriver, bruised, waterlogged, gone. The body was wrapped in cloth, laid on a mat like a warrior's remains. But when Amina saw him, she knew. The bruises weren't from river rocks, they were finger-shaped. There were ligature marks around his neck, and a strange burn on his ankle, like he had been shackled." The council chose silence. Ntemi insisted the death was an accident. He said Jomo had gone to confront him and in his panic, fled and tripped into the river. "I tried to save him," he wept. "But it was too late." Amina, broken and burning inside, whispered the truth at the boy's grave. "I will find who did this, even if I must walk into the spirit realm myself." A week later, whispers began. Amina was called into questioning by the village elders. They said a child overheard her wishing death upon Jomo for disobeying her. Another claimed to have seen her at the river that night with red cloth tied to her waist, a color only worn during sacrificial rites. "They're framing you," said her best friend Zawadi. "You know who." Amina knew. Ntemi's power was expanding. The villagers feared his influence. He gave food to the poor and coin to the guards. All he had to do was paint Amina as a bitter sister whose anger had turned to sorcery. Still Amina fought. She visited the priestess in the hills, begging for guidance. She consulted the bones. They fell in a pattern none had seen before, a circle within a circle, surrounded by cracks. "The boy is not silent," the priestess whispered. "He is between worlds. And he is angry." Amina lit fires at every corner of her hut, praying, weeping, shouting Jomo's name to the wind. One night, as thunder split the skies and the river roared louder than ever before, she felt it, a coldness that wrapped around her shoulders like a hug she had known all her life. She turned. And there he was. Jomo stood at the doorway. Not wet, not broken. Just glowing faintly. His eyes were sad, but his lips did not tremble. "You tried to protect me," he said. His voice was wind and water and memory. "But they wanted silence. They took me because I saw the land papers, the truth scratched out." Amina reached out, but her hands passed through him. "I will speak for you," he said. "They will hear me." The next morning, the entire village awoke to the sound of crying goats and dogs howling in circles. On the door of the council hut, a message was etched in ash. "He lies." The river saw. Each day after that, something strange happened. A child spoke in their sleep, in Jomo's voice. An elder dropped her gourd when she saw Jomo's reflection in her basin. Temi began to lose sleep. He claimed he heard footsteps pacing his roof. The village, once content to watch in silence, began to murmur. At Jomo's grave, offerings began to appear. Flowers, carved toys, pebbles shaped like hearts. The village was shifting. The truth was gathering its own weight. And Amina? She stood tall. Her grief was not gone, but it was no longer her burden alone. She carried a promise now. A bond that even death could not snap. Because Jomo had spoken. And the wind carried his words. The morning Jomo's body was found, the village did not wake gently. It was the scream of a goat herder that split the air like thunder, echoing through the clay walls and thatched rooftops. By the time the sun had risen above the hills, the path to the sacred tree was littered with bare feet, whispers and wide, wet eyes. Jomo's body lay curled on its side like a child asleep. Except he was not asleep. His skin had turned a strange blue near the lips, and his fingers were stiff as though clenching something that was no longer there. The sacred tree above him, ancient and sprawling, seemed to mourn with its heavy branches drooping lower than usual. At first there was silence. Then someone noticed the amulet. It lay beside him torn, the leather strap frayed as if ripped in a struggle. It was the one Amina had given him on his 9th birthday, a charm of protection blessed by the village priestess before her exile. The fact that it was broken seemed more like a symbol than a clue, but then came the others. A knife. Amina's hunting knife, etched with her initials on the wooden hilt. It was found a few paces away, half buried in the dirt, its blade dark with something none dared to name until they sniffed it, copper, unmistakable. Blood. And then the footprints. They were light but clear, shaped by the familiar soles of Amina's goat-hide sandals. They circled the body, stopped near the knife and led back toward the path to their home. Someone shouted. Others joined. Amina. She was found just moments later, emerging from the forest with firewood balanced on her back. Her face fell as she saw the gathered crowd. She tried to speak but the words caught in her throat like thorns. She dropped the firewood when she saw Jomo's body. Her legs buckled and she fell forward on her knees. No. Jomo, no. The chief stepped forward, flanked by 2 warriors. You'll speak at the council, he said sternly. I didn't do this, Amina whispered, tears running down her face. I would never, he's my brother. You told him to stay away, someone from the crowd shouted. We heard you. Yes, because of the land dispute. I was afraid, for him, not of him. But no one listened. The pain in their faces had already twisted into something harder, colder, something that looked too much like hatred. They dragged her to the village center where the crowd followed, buzzing like angry bees. The sacred tree loomed behind them like a silent judge. Amina was not bound. That wasn't necessary. The shame and fear weighed her down heavier than any rope. Old Mumbairo, the village seer, stood and raised his arms. This tree has watched our ancestors rise and fall, he said. It has witnessed births, deaths, and the truth that lives between them. Today it watches again. The evidence was presented, one piece at a time. The torn amulet, the bloodied knife, the footprints, and the witness accounts. Several had heard Amina arguing with Jomo just days before, warning him not to meet with their cousin Baresa, the man at the center of the disputed land. She threatened him, someone shouted. We all heard it. I warned him. Amina cried. Baresa is greedy and dangerous. I begged Jomo not to meet him. But he wouldn't listen. He said he could change Barasa's mind. Someone in the crowd spat at her feet. Baresa stood to the side, arms folded, face expressionless. His silence spoke volumes, but it was what he didn't say that disturbed Amina the most. No sorrow. No anger. Just calm. You think I killed him? She said, turning to the chief. What? Why would I kill the only person I have in this world? You're the only one with a reason, the chief replied. He was going to give the land back to the people. You argued with him. And now he's dead. Amina felt the wind die in her lungs. Where were you last night? The chief demanded. I was, she hesitated. I was in the forest, gathering herbs. Alone? Yes. I didn't know he was gone until now. The crowd murmured again. How convenient, someone muttered. The chief raised his hand. We mourn a boy, a son, a brother, a future warrior, and we face betrayal from within. I didn't do it, Amina said again, her voice barely above a whisper. But words meant little in the face of grief. They did not see her pain, only her proximity to the crime. And that, in their eyes, was guilt. That night, she was not taken to a cell but confined to her hut. 2 guards stood outside. The hut's shadows felt colder than usual, like the walls themselves had turned their backs on her. She sat on the floor and stared at the small fire she had kept burning. Beside it was Jomo's woven doll, the one he made when he was 6 and carried for 2 years before giving it to her with a grin and the words, "Keep it safe so I'll always be with you." She picked it up and wept. Outside, the villagers held a silent vigil. The women hummed low songs and the men passed gourds of bitter root drink. But none sang for Amina. None lit candles for her innocence. At dawn she was summoned to the clearing once more. The priest from a neighboring village had arrived to perform the cleansing rites. He looked at Amina only once and that was enough. He did not see a grieving sister. He saw a vessel for evil. "She must be judged by the ancestors," he said. "Take her to the river tomorrow. She sinks, she is innocent. If she floats, she carries guilt." The old river test, one not practiced in years, abandoned for its cruelty. But today the people demanded justice and cruelty had become easier than questions. That night, Amina wrote her final words into the dirt of her hut floor. "I did not kill you, Jomo. I loved you more than I loved the sun. I don't know why this happened, but if your spirit sees me, please, tell them. Tell them I did not do this." She blew out the fire and lay down, clutching his doll to her chest. The silence of the hut wrapped around her like a burial shroud. Outside the guards shifted nervously. One claimed to hear whispering from the roof. The other saw a shadow cross the moon without shape. Neither spoke of it aloud. And in the forest, the sacred tree creaked for the first time in 100 years. Its roots whispered. Its bark sighed. And something unseen began to stir beneath the soil, awakened by grief, fueled by truth, and carried by a name that still echoed through the trees. Amina. The old hut by the river was built long ago for women accused of unspeakable things. The elders called it a place of waiting, a space between judgment and forgetting. Its mud walls leaned tiredly toward the dark, half swallowed by vines and dust. When they brought Amina there in chains, silence followed. Not even the wind dared pass through its crooked wooden door. The villagers watched her as if she were already dead. Children peered from behind their mothers' wrappers, wide-eyed and trembling. The same children who once ran to Amina for stories or help with firewood now stared at her with a mix of curiosity and terror. The same hands that had once clapped for her tales now threw stones as she passed. She had not cried when they accused her. She had not cried when her own father turned his back, or when her mother wailed louder than the morning drums. But when they locked the door of the hut behind her, sealing her inside with the musty air of decades of dread, something inside her broke like thin clay under fire. The floor was dirt, the roof patched with dried banana leaves and brittle grass. At first, Amina lay still, curled on the ground, her brother's name on her lips. Jomo. Her little brother, the one she had raised after their mother fell ill. The boy with a loud laugh and scraped knees. The one who had promised to never leave her, even when others whispered that she was strange, that she dreamt too loudly and knew things before they happened. That first night, Amina heard scratching. At first she thought it was rats or perhaps the wind. But there was no wind and the scratching was rhythmic, like a message being carved beneath the floor. She sat up, her eyes adjusting to the dark, and that's when she felt them. Thorns. Not just fallen from a bush but growing, winding slowly through the cracks in the floor like they had a purpose. Sharp and glistening, they curled inwards as if trying to embrace her feet. She recoiled, pressing her back against the wall, and bit her tongue to stay quiet. The villagers had warned each other. The guilty would often scream. Amina would not give them the satisfaction. Then came the whispering. It started as a breath, just a single syllable. Her name. She turned her head slowly. There was no one in the hut. Her heart pounded so hard it made her ribs ache. She forced herself to lie still again, her body stiff, eyes wide open. Then the whisper came again. Not angry. Not vengeful. Just calling. Amina. She knew that voice. Every nerve in her body lit up. Jomo. The name stuck in her throat like dry sand. Jomo, she croaked. Is that you? Silence. She crawled to the center of the hut and pressed her ear to the floor. Nothing. But as her breath slowed and her heart calmed, she felt it, a coldness seeping up from the ground, not just temperature but presence. Something was here. Over the next days, Amina stopped resisting the strangeness. The thorns grew each night, sometimes curling into symbols she had seen in their grandmother's old carvings. Circles. Spirals. In the morning they would vanish as if swallowed back into the soil. Each night Jomo's voice returned. Sometimes it called her name. Sometimes it repeated the words he had once whispered to her when he couldn't sleep. Tell me a story, Mina. She did. She sat on the floor and spoke to the dark. Stories of their childhood, their mother, the games they played in the yam fields. And though her voice cracked, she kept going. Each night the hut listened. One night she asked, "Why did you go to the sacred tree, Jomo? Why didn't you stay home like I told you?" Pause. Then a breeze, inside the hut where no wind should exist, fluttered through her hair. "They called me," the voice whispered. "They said they needed me to help fix something." Amina's blood froze. "Who called you?" she whispered back. Silence. The next morning Amina found something new. A small carving in the floor made of thorns, shaped like a hand, palm open, pointing east, toward the chief's compound. By now the guards who watched over the hut no longer came close. They left her food on a wooden tray far from the door, crossing themselves as they backed away. Rumors had begun to stir. "She talks to someone in there. She hasn't aged a day. The thorns grow for her." Amina noticed other things too. Birds circled the roof at dusk, mostly black ones with red-ringed eyes. The ground around the hut was always damp, even when the sun beat down hot enough to crack the village pots. At night, shadows danced on the inside of the walls, not hers. Never hers. She began piecing it together. Jomo had been lured. Someone wanted him gone. And whoever framed her had known exactly what they were doing, planting her knife, arranging the amulet, smearing her footprints in the mud. Too perfect. Too quick. Amina stopped crying. Instead she began to listen. She sat still for hours, hearing things beneath the earth, moans, echoes, a pulse. One night the voice said something new. "They're afraid of me." "Who?" she asked. "They know I'm still here." The next morning the elders arrived. They didn't enter. Just stood a few feet from the hut, their faces hard but nervous. The chief's sister clutched a black cloth in her hands, her lips pursed. "We will speak judgment tomorrow," one said. "Prepare." Amina smiled. That night the thorns burst from the floor like claws. They writhed and twisted, forming a ring around her body, then gently lowered back down. The floor pulsed like a heartbeat. "I'm ready," she whispered. And in response her brother's voice, "I'm coming too." She slept deeply for the first time since the death. And in her dream Jomo stood beside her, older now, taller, with a staff made of braided reeds. He touched her shoulder and said, "They can't silence me anymore." She woke before dawn, her hair damp with dew. The hut was glowing faintly from within, the walls painted with symbols and river clay, some ancient language she had never learned but somehow understood. When the guards came to fetch her, they paused at the door, unwilling to enter. She stepped out herself, barefoot, the thorns parting before her feet like blades of grass. The village watched as she walked toward the council clearing. Some whispered. Others covered their faces. But one child stood near the path and pointed up. "Look," he said. Above the hut, high in the air, birds flew in a perfect circle. And from the ground behind her, the scent of fresh river water rose like perfume. The story was not over. Not yet. But the hut had remembered, the earth had listened, and Amina, the sister accused, had found the first thread of truth. And her brother had started speaking again. The moon hung low over the village, swollen and pale, like an ancient eye watching the sins of the living. The entire village gathered in the central clearing, a circle formed around the sacred baobab tree where trials of the old days were once held. Tonight, that forgotten tradition was revived, summoned by fear and desperation. Amina was brought in chains, her hands bound in fiber rope, her face streaked with dried tears and dirt. She walked barefoot across the cold, cracked earth, her wrists trembling but her back unbent. Her eyes scanned the crowd, the same people she'd grown up among. Familiar faces twisted now in fear, in suspicion, in something darker. A hush fell over the clearing as the eldest elder, Osiro, lifted his staff and struck it 3 times against the earth. "Tonight, by the laws of our ancestors, we gather to decide the fate of Amina, daughter of Rukia," he announced. His voice, old as bark, echoed across the gathering. Amina looked up toward the moon, feeling its pull in her bones. She wanted to scream her innocence, to claw through the silence that had smothered her since her brother's death. Jomo. Even now, the sound of his laugh haunted her, sharp and sweet like a songbird's call. But that sound had vanished the night he disappeared near the sacred tree. What they had found instead was his lifeless body, cold and twisted, as if dropped by a vengeful wind. The trial began. Witnesses were called, her aunt who spoke of the bitter land dispute between Amina's mother and the powerful uncle, a farmer who'd heard the siblings arguing the day before Jomo went missing, the weaver who claimed to have seen Amina walking toward the sacred tree with a bundle in her arms. And then there were the objects, Jomo's torn amulet, buried in the mud nearby. Her knife stained at the tip. Her footprints leading to the roots of the tree and returning alone. All of it, circumstantial, flimsy, yet overwhelming in the eyes of those whose grief clouded judgment. She was always different, someone muttered from the crowd. Too bold, too clever. She read books instead of learning to knead yam like the rest of us. She spoke out of turn. She told Jomo not to go to that tree, they say. As if she knew what would happen. The whispers turned venomous. Children clung to their mothers. Even her childhood friends would not meet her eyes. The air thickened with unease. When her turn to speak came, Amina's voice trembled but did not break. He was my brother, she said. My only brother. I warned him because I loved him, not because I meant harm. One elder, the youngest of the council, frowned. And yet the knife was yours. Yes. But I did not place it there. Someone wants this to look like I did. Another elder, thick-lipped and grim, crossed his arms. And who would want to frame you? I do not know, Amina admitted. But I know I didn't kill Jomo. I felt it. The moment he died, I was in the hut. I heard a whisper. His whisper. He said my name. A stir ran through the crowd. You expect us to believe the dead whisper? Elder Osiro said coldly. I don't expect you to believe, she said, stepping forward despite the chains. But I will speak it anyway. Then the wind changed. It began as a low moan through the branches of the baobab tree, then lifted into something more eerie, a whistle that curled through the villagers' clothing and reached deep into their spines. The fire in the center of the gathering flared suddenly, casting tall shadows that danced like spirits rising from the dirt. Some people backed away. The mothers held their children tighter. Amina gasped. She felt it again, Jomo's presence. Stronger than before. Her tongue moved before she could stop it. He's here, she whispered. Silence her, one elder barked, fear leaking into his tone. But Osiro raised a hand. Let her speak. Amina's lips parted, and a voice came out that was not entirely her own. I did not fall. I was pushed. The crowd gasped. The voice was high, youthful, unmistakably Jomo's. I trusted him, the voice said. He followed me. Said he would teach me a lesson. Who? Osiro demanded. Whose spirit? But the voice had faded. Amina collapsed to her knees, sobbing now, but the crowd stood frozen. The eldest women in the crowd began to wail, the high mourning song passed down from generation to generation when spirits walked too close. Some elders covered their faces. A baby began crying and would not stop. A dog howled in the distance, and the moonlight flickered as clouds passed overhead, briefly darkening the scene. Then someone screamed. A man near the edge of the crowd was pointing toward the sacred tree. There. A shadow. Eyes turned. At the base of the ancient tree, a figure stood, not fully seen but enough for the village to feel dread bloom in their hearts. Short. Young. Holding a broken amulet in one hand. The figure slowly raised its other arm and pointed, not at Amina but past her, toward one of the elders. Osiro. No, Osiro stepped back. It is a trick. A trick. But others were watching him now, eyes narrowing. What trick could show us the boy's face? Someone whispered. Didn't Osiro's son lose land to Amina's family last harvest? And didn't Osiro have Jomo watch the goats last week? Near the sacred tree? Osiro raised his staff. Silence. But the crowd was no longer his. The people surged with murmurs, and the other elders began to look uncertain. The women's wails grew louder. And then Amina, still kneeling, lifted her face. Let me be judged, she said. Not by men but by the gods. If I am guilty, let the river take me. If not, let it spit me back. Osiro's eyes widened. That old right hadn't been used in decades. But he saw now the tide had turned against him. He barked to the guards, take her back to the hut. We'll reconvene at dawn. But no one moved. Then, in the distance, the river howled. It sounded like a scream, layered and long, like a girl's cry swallowed by water. The villagers turned toward the sound, faces pale. A torch flickered out. The fire pit hissed and collapsed into steam. Amina stood. The ropes on her wrists had burned away, no one saw how. But they lay at her feet, frayed and blackened. The trial had ended. But judgment had not. Osiro stumbled back, falling into the roots of the baobab tree. She's a witch, he cried. Don't you see what she's doing? No, said the young elder, the one who had frowned earlier. We see what you did. The crowd did not chant. They did not scream. They only stared. And in that silence, something ancient returned to the village. Not justice, not revenge, but a reckoning long overdue. The moon broke through the clouds once more, silver and watchful. Amina walked away from the clearing alone, her chains forgotten, her steps unbroken. Behind her, the people parted, not in fear, but in awe. And from the base of the tree where Osuro had fallen, a soft breeze lifted the dirt, revealing the missing piece of Jomo's amulet. Stained with something dark. Something old. That night, no one in the village slept. Not because of fear, but because in the deepest part of their dreams, a voice began to speak. A boy's voice. Whispering truths they had all tried to bury. The trial was over. But the story was only just beginning. The night was unnaturally still. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath as the trial of Amina hovered on the edge of final judgment. The elders sat rigid beneath the sacred baobab, their hands gripping staffs carved with ancestral symbols. The villagers gathered in tense silence, their faces etched with sorrow, suspicion, and something deeper, dread. Amina knelt before them, her wrists bound, her face streaked with the dust of long nights in the prison hut. Her eyes searched the crowd, not for mercy, for she knew better, but for a sign that someone, anyone, still believed in her innocence. None met her gaze. Not even her aunt, who had once braided her hair before ceremonies. Not even her childhood friend, who used to sneak her roasted yams. As the chief elder began to raise his hand, signaling the final verdict, the last breath of hope, an icy wind blew through the clearing. The torches flickered violently. A low moan rose from the direction of the river. Some thought it was the wind. Others knew better. Then he appeared. At first it was only a shimmer, like moonlight dancing on water. Then slowly a shape began to form within the shimmer. A small figure, thin, barefoot, hair matted with dried leaves. The crowd gasped in unison as the form stepped forward, glowing faintly, like mist lit by the stars. It was Jomo. His eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed not on his sister, but on the elders. Water dripped steadily from his small frame, pooling at his feet and soaking into the earth. The ground, dry for weeks, drank greedily as though the river had sent him with purpose. A woman screamed. Another dropped her child. But most were frozen, bound by the impossibility of what they saw. I could not rest, the ghost of Jomo said, his voice a breath carried on wind and shadow. I could not return to the ancestors while a lie lived in my place. The elders trembled. Even the chief elder's staff, which had stood unmoved for decades of trials, slipped from his fingers. Amina did not kill me, Jomo continued. She warned me. She loved me. She would never. He faltered, his voice catching like a branch in the current. The glow around him pulsed. It was our uncle, he finally said, his eyes glistening with spectral tears. He lured me into the forest. Promised me I'd help settle the land argument. Said we would make peace. But he lied. Murmurs spread like fire among dry leaves. Faces turned toward the old man in the back, Uncle Cafo, who had kept silent during the trial. He stood still, sweat pouring down his brow despite the cold. He said I was in the way. That I was just a boy who would inherit what he deserved. He pushed me. I fell near the sacred tree. I called for help, but he ran. Then, the river took me. The ghost turned then, finally looking at Amina. Her lips trembled. She whispered his name, but no sound came out. The tears she had kept buried burst forth like floodwaters. She fell forward, palms pressed to the earth, her body shaking with grief and relief. Her brother had come for her, not as she wished, but as she needed. I saw her looking for me, Jomo said softly, his form flickering. She cried out until her voice broke. She searched the woods alone. She lit fires, left bread for the spirits, sang lullabies to bring me home. She did everything. And still, she was blamed. Jomo turned back to the crowd. You believed the knife and the footprints, but not her love. You saw her silence and called it guilt. But it was pain. You let fear write her story. The wind howled once more, sweeping through the crowd like a wave. Torches blew out. Babies cried. Somewhere, a mother wept loudly, pressing her child close. Uncle Cafo staggered forward, eyes wild, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for breath. Lies, he croaked. Ghosts don't speak. This is her trick. Her witchcraft. But even as he spoke, the earth beneath him softened. Mud clung to his ankles. He tried to step back, but the ground refused to let go. From the shadows, the river's sound grew louder. Not crashing or roaring, but whispering. Names. Secrets. Vows broken under the stars. You were my uncle, Jomo said, now glowing brighter. You were meant to protect us. Cafo screamed, tried to flee, but stumbled. The mud crawled up his legs as if the river reached for him through the earth. He fell to his knees, then to his side, clawing at roots, eyes rolling in panic. "Forgive me," he shrieked. "I only wanted what was mine." "No," came the whisper. Not Jomo, not Amina, not any human tongue. It was the river itself. It had remembered. Jomo looked once more at Amina. She had risen to her knees. His glow reached for her, a final warmth, like a farewell. "Live," he said. "For both of us." Then just as he came he was gone. The mist faded. The wind stilled. The river grew silent. The crowd stood in stunned silence, shaken and breathless. The chief elder cleared his throat but found no voice. The staff that had fallen was retrieved and handed to him by a trembling hand. "The trial?" someone began. "No," the chief elder said finally, his voice hoarse. "There is no more trial. The dead have spoken. And we must listen." He turned to Amina, who looked too exhausted to stand. "Forgive us," he said, "for doubting your grief, for failing your love." Some villagers wept openly. Others fell to their knees, asking the ancestors for forgiveness. Uncle Kafo was bound and taken away, screaming that he'd be haunted, that Jomo would come again, that the river had his name. And perhaps it did. Amina stood slowly, her limbs aching, her soul heavier and lighter all at once. She looked at the river in the distance. The surface shimmered with the moon's light, peaceful now, as if, for tonight, it was satisfied. But she knew. The river would always remember. And Jomo's voice would echo in it, until the world finally understood what love, betrayal, and truth really meant. The villagers said they saw him leave at dawn, not with fear in his stride, but with a strange calmness, like a man who believed the world would never catch up to his sins. He wore his finest tunic, the one embroidered with red and gold, as though dressed for something sacred or final. No one tried to stop him. The uncle, Bakery, had been silent since the ghost appeared. Even when Jomo's spirit spoke his name, Bakery had stared into the shadows, unmoved, lips pressed in a hard line. But something had shifted in the air after the trial, something ancient, something none of the elders dared name aloud. By midday the rains came. But there were no clouds. The sky remained painfully clear, blue like a child's drawing, and yet the earth was soaked as if the gods themselves had wept. Chickens scattered, goats bleated without cause, and dogs refused to leave the thresholds of their homes. Everyone knew, the river was speaking again. That evening Bakery was found. The children of the river village were the first to spot him, floating just below the surface, near the bend where the water whispered secrets between the reeds. His body had not bloated, nor was it decayed. Instead, it looked preserved, almost peaceful, though his face was twisted not in fear but awe. His hands, however, told a different story. They were bound in vines, green and slick with river moss, pulsing faintly like veins. These were not ordinary vines. They grew from no soil, sprouted from no nearby plant. They pulsed with memory like they had been summoned. The elders gathered, whispering the old laws, but no one had to say it aloud. The punishment had come from beyond. The spirit realm had claimed justice. The villagers who had shouted for Amina's blood now lowered their heads in shame. They had believed too easily, judged too quickly, and forgotten the wisdom of their ancestors, that truth may be buried, but the dead will dig it up, bone by bone. Amina, still bound in the thorn hut, heard the chants from afar. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9, ran barefoot through the village to deliver the news. "The vines got him," she said, panting. "The ghost said it would happen." When the door of the hut creaked open that night, the thorns that had woven themselves into the walls recoiled on their own. The guard said they saw them move like snakes retreating into the floor. Amina stepped out, not with vengeance in her eyes but with sorrow. Her feet were bloodied, her wrists raw, yet she carried herself with the grace of someone no longer afraid. The wind lifted her hair, just slightly, as though even the air welcomed her freedom. The old priestess, who had once warned the council not to act in haste, took Amina's hand. She said nothing, but in her silence was the apology of an entire people. Bakery's body was buried near the river's edge, as no spirit walker or priest would dare bring it to sacred grounds. Some said his ghost could be heard weeping at night, begging the river for release. Others claimed to see Jomo's small figure watching from the banks, silent and still, until the mist carried him away. The sacred tree where Jomo had been found began to grow a new branch, one that curled eastward, toward the river, toward truth. Children stopped playing near it and mothers lit small fires when they passed. Not out of fear but reverence. The tree had become a witness, its bark remembering what the living chose to forget. In time, Amina was welcomed back into the heart of the village. Not just as a sister but as a protector, someone who had walked through the judgment of man and come out touched by the spirit realm. Elders consulted her before council matters. Children listened to her stories with wide eyes. Her pain had become power, her loss transformed into a legend. But even in peace, the river whispered. Not all were comforted. Some feared what the future might bring if they ever again chose pride over justice. They repaired the hut of thorns, not to imprison another woman but as a reminder that truth sometimes comes with blood, and that the spirits never sleep when innocence cries. The river no longer flooded. The rains returned only when clouds filled the sky. Crops grew. The land healed. But at night, when the wind carried just right, a voice would sometimes rise from the waters. A young boy's laughter, light as a ripple, echoing through the reeds. The morning was quiet, not in the way of peace, but in the way of a wound sealed too soon. The village moved slowly, their eyes lowered, unsure whether to meet Amina's gaze or avoid it entirely. No one stopped her as she walked through the path toward the river, barefoot, holding her brother's burial cloth against her chest. In it, she carried what remained, strands of his hair, the broken charm he used to wear, a piece of his favorite cloth soaked in the water where he had last been seen. She had insisted on burying him herself, not at the village graveyard where the soil was thick with forgotten names, but near the bend in the river, the place he once called the end of the world. The elders had wanted a ritual, a priest, chants, and fire. Amina refused. She said her brother's spirit had already spoken more clearly than any of them ever had. What he needed was not ceremony but remembrance. A place where his story would never be rewritten, where no one could twist his name or tie it to falsehood again. She dug the grave with her hands, the river mud clinging to her fingers like a second skin. She wept, but not as a girl broken. Her tears came with the silence of someone who had cried too long, too deep, and now only bled emotion from the center of her bones. Beside the grave, she planted a seed from her mother's old satchel. It was a memory tree seed, passed down through generations but never planted. Her mother used to say the tree only bloomed when the dead had something left to say. The earth accepted the offering without resistance. The seed vanished beneath the soil like it belonged there all along. When she finished, Amina knelt beside the grave and whispered the last words Jomo had said to her. Don't let them turn my silence into a lie. The wind moved through the trees as if listening. The river flowed quietly, not roaring but humming, like it too had heard the promise and approved. She stayed there until sunset, watching the soil settle. As the sky turned gold, then crimson, then the deep purple of coming night, a strange thing happened. The soil where she'd planted the seed cracked softly, and from it, a thin red sprout pushed upward. It glowed faintly, like something breathing beneath its skin. The villagers who had followed her at a distance gasped. Some ran. Others fell to their knees. No one had seen a memory tree bloom the same day it was buried. And none had ever seen it bleed color before nightfall. Red meant the spirit lingered. Red meant protection. Amina didn't smile, but her hands unclenched. She touched the sprout and whispered, "Thank you, little one." Then she stood, wiped her muddy hands on her dress, and walked back into the village with a strength that didn't need to be spoken. She had buried her brother, but not his story. The days that followed were quieter. The whispers died out. No one called her names anymore. They nodded when she passed, and some began to greet her with reverence. Mothers held their children tighter. Elders sat in longer silence during meetings. The tree by the river grew faster than anyone expected. Within a week, it stood waist-high, its leaves sharp-edged and red-veined. Birds didn't perch on it, but they circled above it as if guarding something sacred. Every morning, Amina visited it. She spoke to Jomo about her dreams, about the village, about the boy who tried to leave her behind but never truly could. She brought him river stones he used to collect and pieces of dried mango they once shared. Sometimes, when she left, she found one of the stones moved or a single red leaf lying where none had fallen. The villagers began calling it the tree of guarding. Some said it was dangerous. Others swore it healed fevers when one slept beneath it. But no one touched it without her blessing. It was hers. It was his. It was the truth that refused to die. Amina never left the village. She became its quiet guardian just like the tree. And though she smiled rarely when she stood beside the memory tree, people saw in her a light that flickered from something deeper than forgiveness. It was love, unbroken, undefeated, rooted in pain, watered by truth, and blooming red for all who dared to remember. The memory tree stood taller now, its crimson leaves whispering even when there was no wind. The villagers had stopped calling it strange. Now they brought offerings, food, beads, songs, placing them gently at its roots. And always they came to Amina. She lived in the same old hut by the river, no longer as a prisoner but as a guide. At first people came out of guilt. Then curiosity. Finally, out of need. They brought names of the lost. Mothers who died in childbirth, sons drowned too young, husbands who vanished without goodbye. They came with questions, hoping the dead might answer through her. Amina never promised anything. She would only sit with them in silence, eyes closed, palms pressed to the dirt, and listen. Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she laughed, and villagers swore it sounded just like Jomo. Other times she said nothing at all, only standing and walking to the memory tree, where a single leaf might fall into her hand. She would hand it to the one who asked, saying, "They've heard you. That's enough." People began calling her the girl the spirits defend. She did not wear robes like the old seers. She didn't chant or light fires. But her presence changed things. Babies born near the river were said to come out smiling. Crops planted near her hut grew tall even in dry seasons. Disputes ended when she walked between the arguing parties. No one dared lie in her presence, not because she punished them but because their own ancestors might. The elders grew uneasy at first. They held another gathering under the moon, whispering about control and tradition. But then the youngest elder, whose father had died mysteriously in the last floods, stood and said, "She gave me my father's last words. And they were kind." No one dared speak against her after that. Amina didn't ask for followers. But still they came. Children sat by her side, learning to listen to silence. Widows brought threads and taught her to weave symbols into cloth, not as offerings but to honor the voices she heard. Some nights, even the old priest who had once called her cursed, came with trembling hands and a heart full of regret. One night, a woman from another village arrived, carrying a bundle wrapped in white. Her daughter had vanished months ago, her body never found. She had searched every river, climbed every tree. Now she stood before Amina, eyes hollow, saying only, "Please? I just want to know if she's cold." Amina took the cloth in her hands. She did not open it. She closed her eyes, pressed it to her chest, and waited. For a long time nothing happened. The river was still. The tree behind her made no sound. Then a soft breeze moved through the leaves, and a single red petal floated into Amina's lap. She opened her eyes and said, "She's with the stars. She says the sky holds her and she watches you through the wind." The mother collapsed, not in grief but in relief. Amina wrapped her arms around the woman and held her until the stars blinked out of sight. At night, alone, Amina still spoke to Jomo. His laughter came not in echoes but in memories so vivid they danced through her body. She would close her eyes and remember how he used to skip stones, how his voice had cracked the year he tried to sing with the elders, how he once told her that death could never silence someone who still had love tied to their name. She whispered back, "I remember." And it was in remembering that she became more than legend. One day a child asked her, "Why do the spirits defend you?" Amina smiled softly and replied, "Because I listen when others turn away. And I never lie about the dead." She never used her gift for power. She never charged for her words. But she never let anyone forget Jomo. His story was part of every truth she told. His memory rooted her to the earth, and his spirit gave her strength. When children asked about the tree, she told them the story as it was, how a brother was lost, how a lie almost buried him, and how truth, like a seed, grew back stronger. The red leaves of the memory tree never turned brown. Even in drought, they stayed bright, pulsing with the faint glow that only those who truly believed could see. Sometimes at dusk, when mist gathered around the roots, some villagers claimed they saw a boy playing in the shadows, skipping between the branches, laughing just out of reach. They said he wore a torn amulet and walked with bare feet, never touching the ground. And always, Amina would smile and say, "He's just checking on me." Years passed. Amina grew older but never frail. Her eyes remained sharp, her voice calm. She taught others to listen not for voices in the air, but for truth inside themselves. And the village changed. They no longer buried secrets. They sang the names of the dead aloud. They planted memory trees for every child lost, every elder gone, every silence broken. And though Amina never called herself a leader, her spirit led them all. She lived with love wrapped around her like a cloak stitched from every soul who had whispered into her ear. And when, at last, she too was laid to rest beneath the memory tree, its branches bloomed brighter than they ever had before, not mourning her, but honoring the girl who had once been blamed, once been silenced, but who chose to rise and listen. The girl the spirits defend. And the truth that never dies.